lot of different
Right.
It's funny, like Kellogg always
Well,
chose
that's a good
series
class.
because at first I was like really awkward about doing it, but literally everyone's doing it like right to your face. I'm like, all right, here we go. So now I just like genuinely.
yeah, it's really just to like because
Yeah, exactly.
it's kind of the counterpart of engineers thinking that they do like if something compiles or something runs like they've mastered it.
That was a fun class.
People who can do it, should do it. And people who know it, doesn't know how to do it.
No, exactly. So I'm hopefully trying to brain out
That's exciting.
that's exciting.
Oh yeah, that's excellent.
I think the only questions I have are just like logistics and accounting type stuff. But I think
If you that's what he promised to do, that's great. It may not be easy, but if you can do it, it's awesome. It's great. New data for us.
yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Ah,
Yeah, I am actually walking back.
Hi. Hi, nice to meet you. Kristen is media psychologist. Was it Dallas?
they hear about 20 or so students.
Yes.
Almost all senior. Yeah, very diverse. Obviously, very few white guys. But there's one or two. Quite a few Asians, some Latin Americans, Hispanics, one black kid.
I mean, it hasn't even started yet, so it's like 1 3-hour.
No, I promised to limit my lecture within 1 hour. But the first half lecture and second discussion.
So thank you all for coming today and welcome to the first in-person RCGD Winter Seminar Series since the pandemic. It was also my first time attending the series, so I'm excited to be here helping to organize it. And so we'll have an entire semester looking at different perspectives on political polarization from experts in many different fields. So William Brady is here to kick us off today, and France will be introducing him. But just if you're interested in staying sort of on the list and in the loop of the new speakers in the talk, please make sure you add your email to the sign-in sheet. Is that back somewhere here? I think Aaron had. Otherwise, yeah, join me in welcoming William.
Hi everyone, I'm just here to introduce Professor Brady real quick. Professor William Brady is a computational social psychologist and an assistant professor of management and organizations at Northwestern University, Kellogg School of Management. He obtained his PhD in social psychology from New York University in 2018, where he worked with J. Van Bell. Before beginning his professorship, he completed a postdoc at Yale University working with Molly Crockett. His research centers on the dynamics of emotion and morality in social networks and their consequences for group behavior. Professor Brady's most recent work examines online trolls' role in sowing animosity between groups through polarized rhetoric, and his methodology spans behavioral experiments, big data, and natural language processing. Professor Brady's research has been published in leading journals such as PNAS, Science Advances, and Perspectives on Psychological Science. His work has also been featured in popular press outlets, including the New York Times, BBC, Wired, and the Wall Street Journal. He received the NYU Fraser Thesis Award, Fraser Thesis Award for Best Doctoral Dissertation, and was awarded the Sage Emerging Scholar Award in 2021. which recognizes the outstanding achievements of early career scholars in social and personality psychology. We are excited to have Professor Brady here to help kick off our semester-long series focused on political polarization. So help me welcome Professor Brady once more.
Yeah, thanks so much for the introduction. It's really great to be here and to see this big group of people interested in intergroup conflict and polarization. Yeah, I'm coming over from Chicago. It's my first time in Ann Arbor. I like the snowy background. It's fun. So I'm gonna talk about some more like unpolished stuff today. I hope that's okay. I love to get feedback. And most broadly, what I'm interested in lately is thinking about how, you know, as we interact more and more in these digital environments that have algorithms that mediate the information that we learn from, the social information we learn from, how does that change very broadly what it means to think about the Lewinian person by situation interaction? We have, for the first time in history, you know, we're learning from others and the behavior of others, but we're also learning from the outputs of these algorithms that are both responding to our behavior, but also amplifying things that make us in turn respond to it. So I think it's a really interesting perspective. I'm going to be talking about one case study of this broader phenomenon. And if you have other ideas of, you know, interesting things to look at in this broader area, I'd love to talk more about it. So let me bring into this case study of moral outrage in online social networks. And I want to start by thinking about this question that's, you know, related to polarization, which is, what is the role of social media in the rise of political polarization in the US, especially when we think about the broader trajectory of media in polarization? So any of you who were around in the 80s might recognize who this person is on the left, of course, Ronald Reagan on the right. But by the way, how many people know who that is? Some? Okay, so yeah, a couple people. So that's Jerry Falwell, who was one of the most influential evangelical pastors in the US in the 80s and 70s. And at his peak in the 80s, he had 20 million people tuning into his evangelical TV network behind only HBO and Turner. So it was a really big deal. And what was the message that he was sending around to people in the US? Well, it was specifically a message of outrage stoking and moralization. And it was used as a tool to organize the political right against the political left. And actually, the right really outsourced their political organizing to these evangelical networks. So you can see it's like, we're fighting a holy war. What's happened to America is that the wicked are bearing rule. We have led the nation back to the moral stance that made America great. You might recognize some of that rhetoric from previous president, but yeah, we've seen the same kind of thing, this outrage stoking and moralization used since the 80s through media. You know, Pat Robertson and Trump, lots of other politicians. And so partially what we see on social media is really just more of the same when it comes to media. We have political elites and hyperpartisan news organizations that are specifically stoking outrage and increasing moralization in order to, you know, have political influence. And this is something that's happening on social media, just like it happened in traditional media. But what I argue is that there's also some unique features of social media that do make it different than traditional media. And these are the precise things that we need to study if we want to understand the role of social media and the rise in polarization. So I'll talk about what some of those are. One of the key perspectives emerging in the human-computer interaction literature is that social media should be understood as a context of collaborative work. And so what that means is we're getting information broadcasted to us just like in traditional media, but we also are engaging with this information in a participatory way. And so what that means is you have information transmitted, but now we're also seeing people on our social network engage with it. They're sharing it, they're liking it. They're also even voicing their own outrage in response to it. And so outrage and moralization become a social reality more so than with traditional media. And there's something that I previewed earlier that is especially unique about this, which is that our understanding of that social reality is influenced by content algorithms. So we have this kind of complex case of human algorithm interaction in the context of morality and politics. And I think that is something worthy of greater attention. So what I want to do now, I believe, yes, that is what I want to do, is this newer stuff. I want to talk about how I've been conceptualizing this problem, which I call algorithm-mediated social learning. And then I'll go through some empirical evidence that was my kind of first pass at looking at some of the outcomes of this concept. But I'll start by taking a little detour into thinking about this. And I love to hear thoughts about this. Oh, I should have mentioned. So I'm coming from a business school. I'm very used to people interrupting at any point. So feel free to jump in. No need to wait till the end. More interrupting is great. So I want to start by thinking of the issue of human algorithm interaction on social media as a problem specifically of social learning. So we know that humans are prodigious social learners. We are learning from a very young age from things that people are doing. We observe, we're getting reinforced. We are, told directly, you should do this, you shouldn't. And one of the perspectives that comes out of area of psychology called cultural evolution is that social learning is actually an important building block of culture. And, culture emerges through not just social learning, but these specific biases we have in social learning that ultimately can promote things like cooperation and collective problem solving. And some of these functional biases, we can think of them in terms of content and context biases, but they include things like an attraction to and a disproportionate ability to learn from negative information, moralized information, social information, also copying in-group members and copying prestigious models. Now, all of these things, I'm calling them functional because they're theorized, and also there's some evidence suggesting that they do have these specific functions. So for example, negative information, when you're more attuned to negative information, it helps you avoid danger. If you're attuned to moralized information, it helps you avoid social punishment, or it helps deter, helps you detect people who are violating norms. You can copy prestigious individuals because they tend to be a signal for success, and that leads to more efficient social learning and problem solving. So all of these things in the right context actually are very important for the emergence of culture and generally functional social learning. Now, that was kind of thinking about the function of social learning and the biases that underlie it. On the other hand, when we think about content algorithms that are employed on social media platforms, well, they're designed with something different in mind, which is to sustain our attention on the platforms and to increase engagement, right? And if you were a social media designer and you had to make a prediction, well, how do I maximize attention and engagement? What are the things that you think get picked up on, whether or not it was specifically designed to? It tends to be these social learning biases, because again, these are the things that we disproportionately attend to naturally, and also that we learn from. And so, you don't even have to say that the designers of these algorithms did this purposely, but just having this goal of increasing attention, as a side effect, we're going to theoretically, and we also see lots of evidence for this, exploit these social learning biases. And so now, over the last decade, including some of my work recently, but even lots of others now, has shown very specific evidence that, ignore that typo, that there is, these algorithms are amplifying content that really map onto these social learning biases. So negative emotional content, content from in-group member that tends to, trigger this intergroup conflict style of thinking, moral, normative, righteous content, and also content from prestigious individuals, or at least people who are presenting themselves as prestigious. And so this evidence really maps onto these social learning biases. And so I need to think of a better acronym than this, but the goal is to just show you the summary of the kind of content that tends to be amplified as a side effect of the fact that these algorithms want to maintain our attention. They're really exploiting our social learning biases. Now, this is not a problem in and of itself, but I think the issue comes in, and I'm starting to try to think of this as a problem of functional misalignment. So just to summarize, social learning biases generally have this function of promoting cooperation and collective problem solving, but and then content algorithms are designed to sustain attention, and then they exploit those. And the reason, and so you can see here already the functions are misaligned just because they have different goals. And so in practice, the reason why this leads to dysfunctional human algorithm interactions, where we see social media filled with like intergroup conflicts and political polarization, is because what's happening is that by exploiting these social learning biases, it's starting to make an environment that disentangles the function of the social learning biases. And so a lot of these social learning biases have kind of an assumption built in that the environment is one where there's a low amount of the thing that we're attracted to. So for example, negative information or moralized information, once you change the statistical relationship in the environment. Now, instead of getting cooperation and catching wrongdoers, you just get a lot of conflict because the whole environment is filled with negative and moralized information. So that's the basic argument here that I'm calling functional misalignment. And let me bring this back to the specific question that I'll be talking about in the empirical work. So the idea again is that social media is amplifying political elite outrage, and that is happening not just because they're putting that information in the environment, but also because there is a social reality being built around it through social learning. The social learning biases are getting exploited by content algorithms. And I should also mention now there's actually internal evidence beside the academic work directly showing that both on Twitter and Facebook, extreme political content and anger are being amplified by these algorithms. And so this is leading to a situation where this content can get overrepresented in people's news feeds. But as observers, we often are not actually aware of that overrepresentation. So we make social inferences as if it was quite representative. And another thing to mention before I get into the empirical work is that most people are not aware that content algorithms are impacting our social learning. I have some recent data that I'm working on now. It's actually surprising. A lot of people who use social media, they understand that algorithms are involved, but they don't really update their social inferences when you ask them to make judgments. That even when they know algorithms are involved, they're not really thinking about that and how it can impact the representation of information. So that's something that I'll come back to at the end. I think there's a problem of awareness and what we might call algorithmic literacy. So let's see. Today I'll be talking about some recent work to get into some empirical stuff that is examining how outrage tends to be testing whether outrage is overperceived in the context of algorithm-mediated social learning. And really, in this study, we're kind of taking at face value that there's this interaction of social learning algorithm amplification going on, and we're looking to see what are the consequences of that, both at the individual and group level. So this study was a field study where we first wanted to look for specific topics in American politics that were controversial, and this was done the last couple of years. So in this study that I'll talk about, it was looking at, for example, several topics, but some of them were like the Supreme Court confirmation hearings of Amy Coney Barrett. There was stuff about US 2020 election and the earlier stuff, and then also I think maybe abortion topics. So these are basically these topics that we a priori think are going to have a bipartisan outrage across both sides of the political spectrum. And in fact, we do see that in all of our data. So we have a field study, and here's what we do. We collect data in real time when we identify these issues happening. And then we'll call this the author phase. First, we collect these data. And then we have a classifier I built that is a machine learning model that is able to detect moral outrage in text. And I can talk more about the details of that model if you're interested later. It's also open source, so I'll put a link at the end where you can check it out if you want to use it in your own data. Anyway, so it classifies whether these Twitter messages contain moral outrage or not. And then we have a pipeline that will send Twitter users a direct message and ask them to self-report on their emotions. And we're asking them to report how outraged they are on like the 1 to 7 Likert scale, and also to rate their happiness, because we wanted a contrast and motion to compare, which I'll get to in a minute. And importantly, one thing to keep in mind is that we're sending this message both to people that our model expects have a high probability of expressing outrage, but then we also have this other group of people who our model thinks are definitely not expressing outrage. So I make sure I stay in the camera. So there's basically two groups of people that are all lumped together in the study. So yeah, they give their replies, and then we have what we call an observer phase. And we store all the messages from the author phase, and then we show them to another group of participants who we independently recruited. And these were political partisans, Democrats and Republicans, who were also social media users. They were Twitter users. And we asked them to make a judgment using the same scale about the outrage and happiness of several authors. And so every message in the author phase had about 10 observers. And there were 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats, because we are generally interested in looking at if there are any ideological partisan differences. So basically, the reason why I like this is for the first time, we're able to have a direct comparison of what people are reporting they're feeling at the time of sending the message versus how people perceive them. And speaking of timing, I should mention that this was done in a basically as close to real time as possible. So participants in the author phase were sent a direct message within 15 minutes of them actually posting their message. And I have some histograms I can show, but on average, the authors were actually responding very quickly, usually within about a couple of minutes, actually, for a lot of them. But then there was some variation, but everyone was sent a message within 15 minutes. So they're getting actually pretty close to the time. We hope they can then accurately self-report on their emotions, which we can talk about more if you have questions about that. Okay, so yeah, so one of the main findings from this is just going to be looking at the potential discrepancies between self-reports and of the authors and judgments of the observers. Yeah.
Sorry, question about sampling for authors. Is that a random sample of Twitter users, or did you identify certain?
So this is not a random sample. There is some self-selection here, or some selection bias potentially here. So we're identifying users who were sending Twitter messages about these political topics, some which were selected because they expressed outrage, another group was selected because they didn't express outrage, according to our model. I guess we can talk about this now. So there's a lot of ways that with this method, selection bias could creep in. But we took a lot of steps to rule out that these impact these potential selection effects, or that there were selection effects, basically. And I might as well pull up a couple of them now. So one of the things that you can ask, let me see if I can access this quickly. I think I can. One of the things you could ask is like, let's see. Yeah, like, so here's a little graph that's helpful to look at. So the way that we looked into this was like, let's look at the people who responded to our message, they'll say authors. Let's look at people who didn't respond to our DM, because there's also potential selection there. And then let's look at like more of a random sample of users who tweeted about like different topics. And so here, like the things that you might worry about are like the people who we selected are just like way more likely to express outrage or something. We don't find that to be the case. If anything, they're actually showing lower outrage percentage on average in their timeline. So this is us collecting all the users' timelines in these samples. Although the standard deviations are all overlapping, so it's kind of like not any big meaningful differences. They're not more ideologically extreme. And there's some weird differences with like median tweets, but it's hard to interpret exactly what that means. If anything, it's not obvious that like it would impact the results I'll show you, but when you see the results, you could decide for yourself. We can talk more.
You haven't mentioned bots.
Bots, yeah. So we do some screening for bots. There are some automated bot detectors for Twitter specifically, and you know they're okay. These bot detectors. The way that I use it is. So if you have a sample and so for those of you who don't know, there's these bot detectors who basically estimate the probability that a user you collected is a bot. And the way that it does that is by looking at like the frequency of their posting, like who they follow, things like that. And you know, sometimes it can go kind of haywire. Like you can like run it on a friend, maybe you'll find that they have like an 80% probability of being a bot. But what you can do that I think is helpful is you can compare the distribution of a known bot sample to your sample and just look at the distribution. And so first of all, we don't see evidence that our targeted audience has any greater chance of being bots. But then secondly, the people who are using the study are all people who answered our message. So we know from going through, the bot could answer, but they had to answer in a specific way where it's unlikely bots could do it. And we had people going through every message. So yeah, I don't think in this particular case, bots were infiltrating our data in any meaningful way. And then, yeah, this is what I have. Oh, yeah, this is like the distributions of that. So, yeah, but let me show you the results and then we could come back to that. I mean, I think it's a really important issue because of the nature of how we wanted to try to find a big signal of outrage. We kind of forced to do some sampling that wasn't random. Okay, let me find where I was. Okay, here. So, yeah, so the main result, yeah, so the authors were showing the raw self-reports across. I'll show you the results of one study, the study one first, and then the observers is going to be the raw ratings of their perceptions, and it's the same scale. So what do we find? So I guess I'll mention, I'm showing you the raw distributions here, but our statistical models are a little more complex because we have observers who are judging several tweets, and we also have some tweets that seem to be harder to perceive. So we account for that in multi-level models by studying random effects. But anyway, the main results are that we see systematic evidence of an overperception of outrage on the average. So observers are detecting more outrage than is reported by message authors. And it seems to be a decent effect size. And something that's very important is that we actually don't see this for happiness. So one thing you might wonder is, well, do observers just generally overperceive emotions? And we see evidence that it's very selective to outrage. I don't know if that's necessarily a valence thing because we're only looking at outrage versus happiness, but we can at least say we don't see it across the board. And this was an extremely robust finding. So across 3 separate field study deployments, we see the same pattern over and over again. And these field study deployments were separated by about maybe a month or 2 each. So we kind of see this across time and across different political topics that were contentious using the same exact sampling method. Yeah.
Stop me if you're gonna get into this, but I can't help it. Like, are you gonna talk about or speculate on the people who are aligned on outrage that are tweeting outrageous tweets?
Okay, so there's a couple things here. So one thing to remind everyone, the reason why the distribution looks this way is that half of the people were specifically selected for because our model thought they didn't express outrage. And then another thing is that there is some variation between model predictions, are they expressing outrage, and what people are really feeling. However, we actually found this as kind of a secondary thing to be a really good validation of our outrage classifier because it's trained on expressions, and we know that through cross-validation it does really well at predicting expressions, but we find that it's highly correlated with people's feelings, that's nice. Like I don't think that when you're measuring sentiment on social media, you're measuring feelings, you're just measuring expressions. But it is interesting to see that there is a high correlation, but it's not perfect. And so that's why you do see variation. And again, this is also, the classifier is kind of doing a binary judgment, whereas, people are using the full scale here. Yeah.
What was the algorithm selecting on whether outrage was expressed or not? Is that right?
Yes.
So if it was selecting on happiness or not, do you think it would flip for the happiness estimates in that sense, or do you think it's something that's uniquely specific to anger?
Yeah. So like I think what I'm sensing your question is like, is this the lack of an effect in the happiness kind of like a floor effect? I mean, if there's not much happiness to detect, how can you overperceive it? I mean, the thing is like, some people, especially that group again that did not express outrage, There was some variation, as you can see. There were some people who actually had some happiness there, and the the observers are directly tracking that much more so than the observers. But so it's not that there's like no signal of happiness, and that's why I get this, but it is interesting. Like if there was a greater range, maybe we would see this. So I think it would be an interesting follow-up to look at some context where there was like elation or something like that, or where there was kind of like these extremes, and see if it's really about when there are more extreme emotions expressed. So that's an excellent follow-up. Yeah.
That case only for the social media, or but also written text in general, because we are told not to communicate our frustration or anger through email communication because it can be very aggressive and harassing. So I'm not sure if that say anger amplification is only for social media or written text in general.
Yeah, that's a really important point. So yeah, like in the old school communications literature, there is evidence of kind of over perceiving negativity in email. I think that might be what you're referring to. And so we know it is something about the text medium that does it. And it does seem to be asymmetric in that literature for negative too. The thing where I think, so basically what I think is that on social, and I'll show some, actually my next set of results might speak this a little bit. I think that is one component that makes social media conducive to this overperception, but I think the influence of algorithms and norms that are formed on social media can just make it even worse than what you see in email. So yeah, I think that the text is actually an important part of the communication medium, because like basically what you have when you think about that process is you have emotions expressed through a medium with a lot less information richness than face-to-face interaction, right? And so that can make us misperceive emotions more. And I think the why it skews toward negativity, I think that's kind of determined by norms and things that we kind of priors we have for emotion communication that come to the table. Yeah.
So it seems to me that this means that people are successful in communication, no? That is, when I want to say to you that I'm very mad at somebody else, I want to make sure that you understand my anger. So, right, that's the communication 101. Yeah, you have to say it clearly. Is this all that it shows, or you want to go beyond? I'm sure you want to go beyond that, right?
Yeah. So I think you can say it's successful in communicating that you're angry. That is functional, as you said. We want the out group to know we disapprove of a behavior, or the in group. I think the question is, well, if that signal gets amplified to the point where you start to have misperceptions of the out group, you think they're more outraged, or you even think your own in group is more outraged, then that can lead to kind of very odd effects that are conducive to greater conflict, because you have misperceptions of norms, you have misperceptions of out group and in group attitudes. And I'll get to that with some experimental studies in a couple of slides. So see if that helps you. But I think you're right. It does serve the function, but it gets amplified. And I think there's intergroup consequences as a result of that amplification. So in this data, we also wanted to start exploring, what are some of the explanations for this overperception, not thinking necessarily about the platform design, which I've done other stuff, but what are some individual differences? And the main thing that we've looked at a lot of different individual differences that we were able to in these data. But the most robust predictor of overperception of outrage specifically was time spent on social media to learn about politics. And I think that's interesting because it suggests that this interaction with the algorithmic learning environment and people's the kind of content that's spreading, it really shapes our priors about how emotions are communicated, and that is exacerbating this effect. So this is just observational data, but we have some experimental data also that gets a little more at causality.
When you're thinking about the distribution of posting activity on Twitter, where would you place the authors and also the readers?
Yeah, so so at least going back to Nick's question, when we looked at tweeting frequency, the authors are there was a slight difference where they posted actually a little less, I think it was. But generally speaking, the distribution looks pretty similar. When it comes to authors versus observers, I actually haven't looked at that because I wasn't able to look at the observers' tweet history.
I sort of meant like, where the authors are like top 10% of.
Oh, I see.
That sort of.
We don't see evidence for that, where it's like extraordinarily skewed. So comparing the distributions, there's a huge amount of overlap. When we look at the people who didn't respond to our study and the random sample of users who tweeted about a different political topic, if we did a broader random sample of Twitter, we do know from other data the most politically active tend to tweet the most. So that's definitely one issue. But if anything, I think that is the most important population to study. How are they perceived? Because they dominate the content on the platform. And that's what people are most likely to learn from, if that makes sense. Yeah, I don't know if that helps, but okay. So let me now talk about follow-up experiments. I want to make sure we have time for questions. So we were thinking about, well, what are some of the consequences for collective judgments of emotions and also social norms when we have a situation where people are over perceiving outrage in the social media feeds? And so what we did in this experiment is created a mock social media environment where we're going to manipulate the content in people's news feeds and have them make judgments about the social network that they're ostensibly in. And in the study, we actually used stimuli, which were real messages from the database from studies, the field studies I talked about. There are actually 3 of them. And where we put different types of messages in one of 2 feeds, which is either a high overperception or a low overperception feed. And so the idea here is what we're doing is we're manipulating the extent to which these outrage messages tend to be overperceived, but we're controlling for the baseline of self-reported outrage. So the only thing that we're manipulating here is the tendency for people to overperceive those messages, but they all have the same mean amount of outrage in the newsfeed. And so what happens when you ask people to make these collective judgments? How morally outraged do you think members of the social network are? Even though the underlying self-reported outrage is all the same, when you manipulate that overperception factor, you see very large effects of perceived network outrage. Of course, people are thinking, well, this whole network is more outraged than actually the mean of the individual messages, which I actually think is really interesting because it's suggesting that there's something about making a group level judgment that even exacerbates the individual level bias more than what we saw in the field studies. And the other thing that we looked at was a norm judgment task where we use the same method, but now instead of asking about collective outrage, we do this norm elicitation procedure where we're showing them a bunch of new Twitter messages. We manipulate how much outrage is expressed, and then we ask them to make judgments of social appropriateness. And so it looks something like this. And what we find in this is that if people in the high overperception condition were more likely to think that expressing outrage was socially appropriate compared to people in the low overperception condition. And then I'm actually presenting a different score here because actually there is a general tendency for participants to think that expressing outrage is not that normative. So that's why it's below 0. But nonetheless, we get them to think it's more normative when we manipulate the different news feeds. So, and the last DV I'll talk about is effective polarization. So we get them to make judgments about the social network. How much do you dislike, how much does the network you're viewing dislike the political outgroup? How much do they like the in-group? We see pretty big effects for in-group. So they think that the high overperception feed, they think their network likes in-group more. But we see almost double the effect size for outgroup hate, which is basically the typical measure of effective polarization. So if you're viewing this feed with high overperception, you're much more likely to think that your social network dislikes the outgroup. And I think this is where the amplification becomes very important because Now there's several studies suggesting that one of the key contributors to effective polarization, and this can even play into voting behavior, is when you think that the out group is more extreme, is more angry than they really are, and you think the attitudes are more overblown. Both in group and out group actually has been shown. So in summary, for these experiments, social media users systematically overperceived how outrage message authors are, and this leads directly to overperception of collective outrage, and this can also even amplify perceptions of outrage norms and polarization. And I think the reason why this is very important overall when we're thinking about what to do on these platforms is that it can lead to cases of pluralistic ignorance or even spirals of silence where we have these more extreme political views represented in a way that makes it look like a lot of people in our network think this, even though they privately reject that norm. But this is the kind of content that is staying on the platform. So this is why that's very important. And I don't think I have much time left. I want to make sure there's times for questions. So I'll just hand wave real quick and say that.
Yeah.
Oh, do we have time? Does this go till 30? Huh? Oh, it goes till 5. Oh, I thought it ended at 3. Okay. Oh. So I'll do slightly more than hand wave. I'll do something else. So
Guys, question.
oh yeah.
Give you a break. It's fascinating, really. Question is the degree to which this is all specific to Twitter as opposed to other platforms.
Yeah, so I'm doing a study on Reddit right now that is looking to replicate this, seeing if it replicates, and then asking some other follow-up questions. So stay tuned. We'll find out about empirically. I think theoretically there's reason to believe that any platforms in which you do have these cases of algorithm mediated learning, in which you have an algorithm that is selecting for attention and engagement, because of the kind of thing that I talked about in the opening, I think that is going to make the platforms conducive to that to the overperception of negative emotions in particular. But for sure, there's variability by platform. So I think you have to think about, what kind of content algorithm are they employing? And also, what are the norms of the environment? So Twitter was kind of like an important test case because you can find lots of outrage. And there's a lot of contentious stuff going on. So that was kind of our first test. So Reddit will be interesting because on Reddit, we can look at different communities and actually see if there's community norms that affect the finding. So. Yeah.
Related question. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the social mechanisms behind social learning. Is it that there's an audience? I can imagine this is really different across platforms. Is it the fact that other people will read your posts, and as you're reading other people's posts, you're thinking about other people? Is it the interactive component that someone else can engage, which is different on something rather than Twitter, where the interaction is maybe sparser, or how does that play into negativity and outrage? Does it matter if there's an audience or not? Have there been experiments kind of offline where the audience is manipulated versus interaction? Look at how that.
Yeah. There's a lot of stuff there. I think it's really important. So I've done some studies looking at specific social learning processes in the context of Twitter. And what we're finding is that it seems to be a combination mainly of observational learning and reinforcement learning. So the way that I've thought about it in the context of those studies and some recent theorizing is that there's kind of this feedback loop where the algorithms are tapping into our social learning biases, and so they're upranking and amplifying certain content like outrage or negative content or in-group content. But as a result, we see that content and we directly learn from that about what is appropriate, like in some of the studies I was showing. But the algorithms also show that content to people most likely to like that content. And so we're also getting rewarded when we produce the content. So That, I have some studies and there's some recent studies suggesting that a lot of social media behavior besides this political stuff can be explained in reinforcement learning models. So that's definitely some of the processes that I've looked at. Yeah.
Yeah, so like, just if you think about something like a newspaper versus a social media platform, a lot of the social norms are still there in a newspaper, right? Like, and now people have to think this is okay for a newspaper article to be published. But you're saying what's different is that if I push a story on social media, I get instant reinforcement from other people in my network. So it's more the interactive part that you think is different than like other types of media, because I'm told right away if this is an okay message or not.
Yeah, and I think that social approval is more powerful than mere information exposure, right? Because we know that social norms can be very influential. It's more so than just someone kind of just standing like a politician and kind of telling you what do you think is a good thing to believe. When you see someone in your network endorsing it, it becomes more of a powerful influence. And then also there's more of a chance, I think, in the context of social media for fringe views to gain. We were talking about this in our discussion earlier, like to gain legitimacy, because you can, through strategy, like for example, gaming algorithms or even advertising, you can get like friends. So for example, the far right has been documented. This has been done a lot with like QAnon, for example. You can get these fringe views to come out and like to get more exposure. And what happens when a fringe view gets exposure, you're kind of forced to respond to it. But ironically, when you do that, people see it more and it gains this legitimacy. So that's not something, I think if you just have like a news station just espousing extreme views, that's not just going to go into people's heads. I think like what happens is this social back and forth, and then you start to have intergroup processes going on where it's like, oh, well, these people are different than me or they're like me. And, so there's things like that going on. And that's a part of what I was talking about, like the social reality. Okay, we can talk more later. Yeah.
I'm curious what you think about astroturfing of outrage on social media. Because there are groups that want to put out a narrative that public is generally outraged about something. So that's not like, that's a very driven and motivated effort to generate tweets about particularly political tweets. So do you think that shapes how people perceive outrage?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's related to what we were just talking about, where there are people strategically, trying to raise awareness of weird, or I guess like gain legitimacy of these kind of like fringe views. And yeah, I think it's a big problem because so what we know from a lot of survey data is that there's an extreme asymmetry in people's knowledge of algorithms and how to use it to get content to spread. And so when and the people who know how to do it are two types of people: highly motivated political actors, and then also, it also tends to skew young, right? So you're more likely to be aware of how these things are working. And so, yeah, people can have asymmetric ability to gain exposure with ideas. And so that's a problem insofar as it's, in a way, it's like non-democratic because they're exploiting these algorithms that are, being designed by companies. And yeah, so it definitely affects perceptions. I think that's one of the things that I'm studying in this, is that if you have a minority or a fringe view that is still spreading, even though a lot of people wouldn't necessarily endorse it, you have the potential for people to falsely assume that it's more prevalent than it is. And I think that's a lot of what I'm studying.
Yeah. So tweets that leads to overperception are judged as more appropriate. Now, why might that be? Well, I have the answer to that. So almost tweets which are clear, that is meeting the Gricean criteria or informativeness, might be perceived as appropriate, and that can lead to overperception. Do you think that So I think I'm getting back to the same thing, that is, overperception, maybe exactly what speakers or communicators are intending to do. And somehow this, I don't like to minimize the significance of this, but I think basic, driving force might not be, could be some of those, evolutionary psychology concepts. But in addition to it, something like informativeness or something might have to be added.
Yeah, so one of the things that I wonder is an assumption of what you're saying, tell me if I'm wrong, is that there are authors who are intending to express themselves in a kind of almost exaggerated way to really make sure that
I don't know exaggeration or not, just making it clear, making it most informative. That is, I'm pretty sensitive to this because I'm from Japan, and making it too clear is considered immature in that country.
it's considered what?
Immature.
Oh, immature.
Yeah, if you are sophisticated, right, you say it in the most subtle possible way. But this country is not like just you have to be direct and explicit. That could be. Can that be a part of the story?
Yeah, I mean, so I think it can be a part of the story, and it could be why people are likely to over perceive. I guess the question is, why do you think, if that's the case, we see the asymmetry in happiness and negativity? Do you think it's that?
Oh, because I think you said the answer. These are not the messages of happiness. If I were to communicate my joy, the outcome could be similar.
I see. So I think then it becomes important, as we were talking about earlier, to do this in a different context where the communicative environment would be one where, say, it was about elation. And I think your prediction, so you have a pretty strong prediction that we will see the same thing in that context for happiness, because that would have the high communicative value. But if we didn't, that might speak more to like the social learning negativity bias being more important. So I actually really like that. So I think it's another good reason to study in that context. Yeah.
I was thinking it would be super cool, and maybe it's not possible to do this, just wondering, if you could compare the level of outrage or high outrage tweeters against the average level of outrage in their own network, like in terms of who they're exposed to and what their feed looks like. And I was thinking that there could be two possible phenomena going on here, one of which really, I think, centers your older prediction of outrage, like procedure mechanism as like the driving causation, the other which I don't think centers your mechanism as much. I was thinking that I can be very unusual, but I almost never write a tweet without reading a little bit to see what's going on Twitter. And I'm often very conscious about not like misreading the room, basically. So like one time I had this tweet from Brady being like, proud to announce new paper mine just came out, but like it was the day that Russia invaded Ukraine. And the Twitter that day was just completely about like the trauma of war and all that. And I was like, okay, I'm not going to tweet this today. I'm not going to do this tomorrow, etc. So I was thinking that there could be two separate things going on. One could be your mechanism. It's like you are trying to match what you read in your feed, but because you overperceive outrage, what you end up tweeting is something that overshoots. So you escalate, and then that causes Twitter to become more outraged. So it like accounts for this extremism. But the other would be that maybe these high outrage tweeters are not like that. Maybe they're trying to outdo everybody else, and they actually want to be more outraged than what they're consuming. And they're like outraged entrepreneurs who are like trying to impress people that are pissed off there, or something like that. It's not about solidarity. It's more about like showing off or like exceeding others. And this could be like if you could see their network, you could disentangle.
Yeah, so I have some data from another paper where we show that people's outrage expression is predicted as a function of the amount of outrage in their social network. Well, I guess it was a proxy for that, which was the ideological extremity of their network. So that gets at it a little bit, but I think this goes back to the other question about the like astroturfing or whatever. I think the truth is that there is a a small percentage of people who produce a lot of this stuff, and I think in a way, I think both things are going on in your explanations, but it depends on who you're talking about, because there's people who maybe represent the more average person, who actually, well, let's just talk about people who have most likely to be in my studies, who are people who at least sometimes talk about politics. So that's already a certain group, but they might not be super extreme. And I think those people are the most likely to be influenced by the extreme actors in terms of the misperceptions and what it makes them think about the out group or the in group. But then you have these like fringe people who are just kind of going no matter what. And those people are less sensitive to norms and reinforcement learning, which I find in another project. But they also are driving a lot of the content. I think this is one of the problematic asymmetries that drives the misperceptions. I think that helped, yeah.
Yeah, I'm intrigued when we're showing the comparison between outrage ratings by observers versus outrage ratings by tweeters. I was struck by how many of the tweeters said, no, I'm not outraged at all, if I read the scale correctly.
Right.
Which makes me wonder methodologically about the questions that are being asked, but also psychologically what the situation is. That is, it could very well be, after all, Twitter is fun, that people really don't feel outraged, but they like to portray outrage. And so when the observers say this person is outraged, the performance has been successful. So in some sense, that isn't a overestimate. It's actually reading the intent of what the person wanted to portray, which can be quite different from how they feel. So I was trying to figure out how one deals with this betrayal versus authentic feeling difference.
Yeah. So that's an important thing. So let me first say that we're directly measuring that in the study that I was talking about on Reddit, because we're going to be asking them to self-report on their emotions, but also to make a meta judgment about how do you think other people will perceive you. And so any discrepancy in those measures could actually get more directly what you're saying. However, there's some analyses we did in this study that I think at least start to rule out that the effect is only driven by people who are like not really feeling outraged, but just kind of expressing it. And one of the things we find is that, first of all, you find the effect even, so first of all, okay, there's a couple things with that. One, you find the effect of overperception at every point in the scale of outrage self-report. And so it isn't just the case that this whole thing is driven by these people who said, oh, I'm not outraged at all, but then they have these tweets and everyone's saying they're outraged. So you actually see it across the self-report scale. In general, the observer, so this is actually an important nuance. Observers in general are actually tracking variation in outrage expression or feelings, I should say, in a decently accurate way. So it's not like they're wildly off. It's just that they're still estimating more than there is reported. So that's one reason. Also, we in our sample, actually like 60% of authors are reporting like above a 4 on outrage. So it's not like we have all these people who aren't seeing their outrage. The other thing to keep in mind, again, I know it's kind of confusing to think about, but half of the sample is non-outraged people. So that's why you're seeing that distribution. And we actually find overperception for those individuals too, which is interesting. Because those are people who our classifier said we don't see hardly any expression of outrage according to our classifier, but there is still some variation. A self-report outrage is very like truncated, the range. But even in those tweets, we see some evidence. It's less of a smaller effect size, but we still see some evidence of overperception.
See more outrage.
Sorry, what?
That the observers see more outrage.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. So again, I think the real test will be this new study we're doing, but there is some evidence to suggest at least that, this, pure signaling explanation, you might want to call it, it doesn't fully explain the results. Okay, do a couple more and then maybe I'll just do a couple more slides. Yeah.
I just want to follow up with a quick on that note of this overperception of outrage. So is it that of the outrage tweets, they're overperceiving outrage tweets, or is it that they're overperceiving the intended to be not outrage tweets? Do you know like where this overperception is happening in the data, or is it just happening across all the data?
It's happening across all of it because we did analysis where we separate those two types of messages. So we see it, yeah, on both of those categories of tweets. And again, as I mentioned, like if you break it down by the self-reported outrage, we still see overperception at each level. It's actually pretty consistent, like the level, but there is, I think it does get greater at certain points of the scale. But all right.
I'm one of the lay people in the room. I have kind of two questions. One is I was remembering about the, I think it was the internet, IRA, Russian IRA research agency, putting out intentionally divisive content. So my first question was, as a consumer of social media, how much would one suspect is inauthentic content? And two, if being aware of the bias doesn't prevent false beliefs, what do you do to not hold false beliefs?
Yeah, so the second part of your question I'll get to a little bit with these final slides. The first part, yeah, I think it's important. So methodologically, I don't think it's an issue because we did, as I mentioned earlier, I don't know if you're here, we did check for the presence of bots, and I think because of our method and asking people to self-report, we can kind of tell they weren't bots. But in general, there is a problem. I mean, the thing about bots and also, in general misinformation, or the IRA in particular, like all the data suggests that they actually were not as prevalent as like the media would like lead you to believe. But where it does become potentially influential is when they like seed something, but then real people pick up on it, and then real people start to spread it. So I think when I think of bots and like the IRA, I think the real issue is the interaction of real people picking up on like things that they planted rather than them just like directly influencing people. Okay, I'll just finish with a couple more slides. Yeah, so one of the things that I've started to think about is like, like we were just talking about, what are some things that we could do? And it turns out that I think this is actually pretty complex when you're talking about misperceptions of like polarizing content and outrage. When you think of things like misinformation, there's a very clear goal. We should reduce misinformation. We should get rid of it. That's what everyone agrees on. We don't want to pollute the informational environment. But when you're thinking about outrage and polarization, I would argue there isn't really a clear goal because, when you think about it, as we've been talking about, outrage does have this communicative function. It actually does a lot of good things. It can make us aware of moral issues. It can help us, take collective action against the status quo that is, harming social justice. So you don't want to just get rid of it. And it becomes very unclear how you should go about moderating that content. And this is why it's very difficult to make an intervention, because usually in this literature, people think about, well, what's like a design feature I could change to help this? So for example, with misinformation, slap on like an accuracy reminder, and maybe, you get small effects of people being less likely to engage with false news. But in this case, it's really confusing because you don't have a goal, and so you can't really design a model to optimize an outcome because you don't know what that outcome should exactly be. So there's a couple of ways to think about how you get around this problem. One of them, which I'll talk about very quickly now, is to say, well, let's actually just ignore that and think about person-centered interventions where you're just giving people information and letting them decide what to do, given that there's these issues of misperception and algorithmic mediated social learning. So we tried to make this intervention. This was only the first pass. We did this very recently. There's challenges. People aren't necessarily motivated to learn. They're not necessarily going to act on the information. But basically, we created this educational video where we recruited participants into a to learn about this context in which you can get overrepresentation of outrage and politically extreme content. And we just had, we explained kind of some of like the basics of like some of my research and gave these illustrations. But basically what we find so far is it didn't work at all. And I don't know if it's because the intervention wasn't good or if it's that people just can't help but you know, make these social inferences. But we basically are doing the same exact paradigm, and we have the, you know, the instructional video versus the control, and we see that people are still showing these feed effects, where if you're viewing these feeds that have been, you know, it's a simulating algorithmic amplification, they're still thinking that their group is more effectively polarized, and they're still showing the same increase in social appropriateness for expressing outrage. So as people pass the comprehension check, they understood that algorithms can do this, but when then we put them in the feed and we ask them to update, or we have them make social judgments, they're just not updating based on that information. So it could be a bad, intervention. This is very early stages, but I just wanted to show you, here's one thing we did. It didn't work. So yeah, I think there's a lot more to be done here that could be interesting. And that's all I have for content, because I thought we were ending at 5:30, but it's okay. But yeah, I want to thank my collaborators, and I love to answer more questions if we have any. Oh, yeah.
Thank you. That's great. So I just want to, the overperception and underperception manipulation is based on the difference between what the author reported and what people observed,
Exactly.
right? So you talked about some individual differences in predicting like when people overperceive, and it came up a little bit, but do you know yet what content, like, is it just, as Shinobu was saying, like clearer information, or are you able to distinguish content-wise between the ones that are overperceived versus not?
Yeah, so I've done these analyses. So basically looking at linguistic features that are most predictive of being overperceived by observers. And I hesitate to interpret it, because I think we need a much larger data set to really make conclusions. Like, a lot of what we see is very specific context things. So it'll be you know, some words related to the political topic that tend to be like very, like, immediately they signal something that makes people overperceive.
Inflammatory.
Exactly. So I think that, but there are some things that are coming out, like certain words. But again, I think to really get at that, you need a much larger data set, and then I think that analysis becomes really interesting.
And then my other first one, you mentioned you had both like conservative and liberal raters. Did you find?
Oh, right, yeah.
Have you looked yet? Did
So
you find
yeah.
asymmetries or just differences in whether in-group out-group people were accurate?
Yeah, so we actually, in general, don't find any consistent evidence that cross-partisan judgments are more overperceived than within partisan judgments, which is kind of surprising. The one thing we did find is that in one study, Republicans were more likely to be overperceived by both parties, which is kind of interesting. It might just be like context effects. So I think we need more data to really get at that, if there's asymmetries. But yeah.
For the intervention, did you look at the rate of usage as a potential DV? Because one question is, it might have impacted their behavior, but once you're in the platform, the perceptual features of those inputs are hard to correct, even with this other knowledge. But if you're getting a change in behavior, that might be like a little bit of success.
Oh, good. So can you say that part again? So
in other words,
yeah.
in the intervention condition, where you're giving the info, hey, your network is biased.
Yeah.
Is that leading to a reduction in how much they use Twitter?
Oh, I see what you're saying. I got it.
You know, because and just to clarify, the idea is maybe it impacts behavior, the obvious sign of success, but once you're in it, that overwhelms the effective intervention.
Yeah, what you're describing is basically what I'm worried about. I think the best way to look at this is basically, I'm trying to do this in the lab first because I want to do a field study, and I think that's the best, you know, situation to test what you're talking about. But yeah, I do think that's really interesting, and I'm kind of worried about that, is like why these educational interventions might not be ultimately that effective. I think it's interesting either way. It's important to learn. So yeah, I think that's definitely a possibility, and I'm trying to think of how to measure that better. So I'd love to chat more about that. Anyone?
So I have a question about a sort of narrow finding from the
middle study, the experiments about affective polarization and social appropriateness and so on. So the finding that in-group outrage presumably towards the out-group promotes perceived negativity in the network towards the out-group makes sense. I'm curious a little bit about the mechanism you're theorizing for promoting perceived network warmth towards the in-party. That's a relatively complicated meta judgment. It's not just, this is a super tribalistic space, they hate the out-party. It's this is a tribalistic space and it's really insular and pro in-group. Because presumably the tweet doesn't explicitly express in-group solidarity.
Right, that's right.
So are you thinking that people are making that complicated meta judgment? Or is their own tribalistic thinking saying, okay, this is an in-party or an in-group space, so everyone here must also be in-group or what?
I think they are making what you're calling the complicated in-group meta judgment, because I have some other data from a study I'm writing up now that suggests when an in-group member expresses outrage toward an out-group member, we see these huge effects where observer judges that person to be more identified with their political in-group and more of a genuine group member, I guess. So I do think that in the context of social media, it's interesting to see how much of this happens in other contexts, but for sure in the context of social media, I think there is a signaling function where by expressing yourself in this way, it does carry with it these reputational benefits. And also observers were more interested in having a conversation with this in-group member, but they were much less interested if it was an out-group member who did the same thing. So there's these weird intergroup, I would say quite predictable intergroup dynamics in this context. So I do think they're making that judgment because of the data, but yeah, if you have any other ideas.
I wish.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot more to be looked at there.
So this sort of makes me think of another kind of social media moral psych effect, which is that viral outrage often leads to more sympathy for the person who instigated it.
All right.
So pylons, whatnot, feels very good to the people responding to a problematic tweet, but it ends up having the immersion effect of making people sympathetic towards the original transgressor. So my question to you is that a counterbalancing force to what you're describing here, where outrage can lead to homeostatic effects where people start to feel more sympathetic towards the target of that outrage? Or is it something where there's divergence based on identity? So the more pylon there is, the more it feels gratifying to me as a member of one group. And if I'm neutral, I start to get alienated or.
For sure, yeah. So if I recall in that study, I want to say that it was pretty stripped of intergroup context. I don't know if you remember.
It's racist tweets, so it's not explicitly partisan.
Yeah, it's not explicitly. That's what I meant. It's not explicitly partisan, but obviously there's implied, yeah. So, because I remember my reaction to that study, was that it would be interesting to see if you get the same effect. Also, it was both a lab experiment. So I think both in the field and when there's more of an intergroup context kind of baked in, you're much more likely to not have that happen. In other words, when the transgressor is the outgroup, you're not going to have sympathy for them. So that's one simple prediction. But I do think that this is more likely to come out with this, some people have talked about the silent majority of more moderate people. I think probably that does happen. The question is, are they the people most likely to voice that opinion in the context of social media? And what the data suggests is they're actually least likely to do a post being oh, I can't believe you would pile on. I totally think that there are people thinking that, but they're less likely to actually voice it. And so that is something that affects the perceptions of everyone else who's not participating. Yeah, but that's. Yeah.
Actually, it's a measurement question. Here you have you're explicitly making this about the signals people are sending, what people are reading off from the signals. Do you have other studies, or do you think about the correlation between signals and attitudes? By that, I mean like, privately, what people are thinking about these issues. Is there a gap between what I think, what I decide to express? And then like, here's like, how much am I turning up that moral outrage?
So I think that's a really interesting question. I think the study I described, the Reddit study, we're asking people to make that meta judgment. I think it'll get at that a little bit, because basically the idea is like, if people are self-reporting something lower than their meta judgment, like, oh, I think people would think this is like a 5, but I'm only feeling 3. It starts to suggest that they're kind of like, they know what they're doing, right? Like they're expressing themselves in a certain way through language, even though they only feel a certain way. So I think there's a lot more work to be done on that. And that's kind of one of the, structural features of social media, I guess all text-based communication, but especially social media, that just makes it prone to misperception. Like all you have to go on is what people are expressing. I could be smiling while I tweet outrage, but as an observer, you don't know that. I think we all kind of just make the assumption that people are genuinely expressing it, when in fact it's not always the case. Yeah.
So again, let me get back to the same issue. If you don't mind. So I wonder if you agree that this is a kind of another demonstration of correspondence bias, dispositional bias in attribution. So basically, the effect is that somebody behaves in some way, say something, right? And the person has lots of situational reasons to say this or that, but perceivers often fail to take note of the context, so that basically perceivers believe that what he says or they say is what they mean, when that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, so one of the things that we check for, so there's a couple things we did to try to avoid a situation basically where the messages that the observers are viewing are kind of, they don't have full context of what's going on. So one is that we recruited observers within 24 hours of recruiting the authors. So basically what the authors are responding to, which is real political events, the observers ostensibly know about this because it's happening at the same time. So that's one thing. The other thing is we did actually test the observers for knowledge of the content of the outrage messages. So these are people who have an understanding of the context. So I'm not sure how else we could really get at that other than like knowing more information about what the person, maybe the connection they have to the event or something. But that is interesting because it sounds like what you're suggesting is perhaps you could reduce the overperception if you give like more contextual information about why the person.
That's what I'm getting.
Yeah.
This may suggest another form of intervention.
Yeah, I do like this actually. So I think, so in summary, I think we accounted in some sense for the fact that people knew about the context, but there could be individuals, mitigating circumstances.
That Gilbert research shows that knowing it is one thing and using it something else, right? So people, Americans fail to take that into account.
Yeah, I like this. Yeah, I love talking more about that. Thanks for all these ideas. Yes.
So I have a question about, there's a slide, I think it was a line graph that showed that folks who went to Twitter to seek out political information had stronger effects. Is that?
They were more likely to overperceive
Right.
the outrage.
Right. So that led me to think of, why do people go to Twitter? Why are you going to Twitter for political information? Right, so that's a really great question. I think, and I would be curious to see if folks are going because they think it's a space that has a lot of outrage. And that is reinforcing and kind of allowing them to feel their own outrage. And so it's kind of like a precedent before like all of these other things that are happening, that it's just this like reinforcing space of, yeah, well, I want to be pissed too. And look at all this that's happening out there. Yeah, we're all angry. And it's just a bunch of performative, folks trying to rile everyone up, and look what they did.
Yeah. So, the two things that are important there, I think, is that, first of all, that is a correlation. So we do have, there's a lack of nuance into is it causing that, or is it, like you said, more of a self-selection thing where there's already these outraged people going there, and so they're trying to get riled up. There is evidence. I reviewed a paper recently. People who are most likely to express outrage and anger online are people who are also most likely to do it offline in interpersonal communication. So there is self-selection, no doubt. But we do have, I think, some of our experimental studies where we're manipulating the feeds and it's impacting people's norms. Perception of norms. I think that speaks to the fact that you can have both going on at the same time. So it is a little complicated. But you're right. I think there is a situation where like you have people already kind of riled up wanting to seek that out. And so I think the question is like, how do you tamper down the amplification of those people's content, because they're more likely to also be doing it strategically, as you said, which can throw off perceptions of like the average attitude in a network or something.
I was wondering, there's a study I heard about a while ago of an intervention of, oh, would you say that in front of your mom? And I just wonder it would be thought of if instead of targeting the perception of others, if you told people something like, oh, this tweet is likely to be affected as you being very outraged. Is that what you intended to write? And if you think that would be effective, that was one question. And then the other question is there any work of when outrage is good? Like if you think of Twitter as the people having contact with political representatives, maybe outrage is a good thing.
Yeah. Okay. So the first question, actually, like Twitter had the thing where it was like the thing you're writing may be viewed as like, or maybe seen as offensive to other people or something. I think they trialed that. I actually can't remember what any empirical outcomes of that were, but it's like gone now, so I'm not sure. So that is interesting. And then I think the problem with that and a lot of these things like viewing offensive content is there are backfire effects. Like people are like
Feel judged. I mean, that's why I feel like this is maybe a little different because it's not so normative. Like you're not saying there's anything wrong with outrage necessarily. You're just saying people will tend to perceive this differently than you intended.
Yeah.
And you could even say something like, because there's research on emotions and emotions that have survival content or amplified, like it feels less normal.
I think it's an empirical question. At the end of the day, like my thought is almost like, it would be really interesting to do just kind of like a contest study where you have like 8 interventions and you're like, all right, let's see which one just empirically turns out to work well. Because there's a lot of predictions you can make. Okay, and then the second question, what was it again?
Outrage is there any-
Oh, right, yeah. Whether outrage is good, yeah. So I mean, I think as I mentioned, there's like, there's some like sociology studies looking at like Black Lives Matter and Me Too movements, and I think those are cases anecdotally where outrage helped raise awareness of issues that have always been around, but it really like brought it to the forefront again. And so one could argue from the perspective of social justice, like that's a really important functional thing, right? So I think it's all contextual, and that's why, like I said, I think it's a big problem when you're thinking about how do we actually content moderate things like outrage, because it's certainly true that they have important functions. But when it kind of starts to go off the rails, then you're like, and it's actually exacerbating polarization, then it seems not to be good. So yeah, these are they're tough questions, but
I mean, yeah, I guess follow up with the second one is, any work that's shown that people are receptive to that those, I mean, it's okay, you can skip that. Like, I think it's hard to prove.
Yeah, so the things that I've seen is like, did social media exposure actually help collective action or like voting? And I think the data are pretty unclear about because usually it's like observational. It's like, well, what is the actual causal impact? If anything, studies I've seen that try to link like exposure to issues and voting are usually like null effects, but there's also like, these papers have been debated a lot. So it's still an open area, I think, for sure.
I had one more question. I've noticed that gender and race are absent from this conversation in general. Did you, when showing your tweets to the observers, did they have like indicators, like profile pictures? Could they see, handles? But like, what were they able to
Yeah,
see?
so we stripped that both for experimental control, but also for anonymity. For sure, there's going to be intergroup effects of perceptions. I mean, that's a very obvious social psychological prediction. And we also know that there's stereotypes and norms that are governing emotion perception. So yeah, there's definitely going to be effects there. In these studies, we remove that information.
I would be curious, mostly because it also helps to look at the different in-groups and out-groups and splice them even further when we're trying to understand who within Republicans are allowed to be angry and show outrage, who within liberals are allowed, to have these platforms and use their voice in that way.
For sure, yeah. I think it's really important future research direction, and in general, it's also a methodological issue because one of the things that we try to do with this classifier is test whether the classifier is more accurate for outrage expressed by different political groups. We looked at race, even though that's very dicey because there's ways to classify race through language, which that's a whole other can of worms. But we also try to look at gender, but the problem is the data are very sparse. So we didn't really get anywhere with that. But I do think it's an important endeavor of measuring emotions in general. Like, there's one example is like the Google, what is it called? The Perspective API that measures like toxicity. Like there are previous versions of it that were shown to have like racial bias where like when a Black person expressed African-American vernacular, it was more likely to be classified as like toxic or something. So these are all issues that really need to be addressed.
I have a related question to Kirsten's, but it's still on the prototype point, about partisan prototypes. Can you separate, well, I don't think you can in these data, but do you think there's a value to separating the social learning biases mechanism for explaining the overperceptions versus these are de-identified tweets from ostensibly like typical partisans, like Doug Aller's work says typical partisans are more extreme than actual typical partisans.
Yeah.
So how much of it is a methodological artifact of these being de-identified typical partisans and people relying on their prototypes for what typical partisans think and feel rather than the content of the tweet itself?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I guess if you assume that the typical partisan is more likely to express outrage, I guess that wouldn't explain though the variation that you see when people are tracking the levels of outrage self-reported. Because like if that was only driving the effect, you would expect these like really like extreme judgments where it's like, oh, this is an average partisan, they must be very outraged. So you're gonna see like almost like a bimodal distribution. But actually, we see, like I said, there actually is a pretty decent correlation with the level of self-reported outrage and the perceived outrage, but then there's overperception. But that could play a role. That's interesting. I think the only way to really disentangle that is to manipulate whether or not they're like a moderate or a more extreme person. Yeah, that's cool. I like that.
As we come up on 5 o'clock, we'll let you take a brief break, but thank you all for coming in.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's great.